welcome to what is now the fourth Science and Conservation event of 2023. It's really great to welcome everyone for what is another in-person event of the programme. So thank you all for coming. So at this point of time, when we're facing two joint and connected environmental crises, a warming planet and biodiversity collapse, it's really easy to become dispirited. I'm sure all of us have our own stories to tell about wildlife that was once common that we no longer see. And over the last 30 years, I've been heading a long-term project on individually recognised cheetahs in the Serengeti, as many of you probably know. And on the regular 7 to 8 hour drive from Arusha to the Serengeti, sometimes it was 9 or 10 hours, Today, I no longer see the wildlife that used to be really common just outside Arusha. I'd see zebra, I'd see impala, I'd see lots of wildlife. I never see them now until I reach the protected areas. Against that backdrop, it seems disheartening sometimes to work to safeguard a species like the cheetah, which is Africa's most threatened big cat, when it's clearly facing these ever-increasing pressures and threats. But against this backdrop, the recovery of large carnivores in Europe provides a really welcome, positive conservation story. In the 1970s, large carnivores were almost eradicated from Western Europe. However, today we can see a spectacular recovery of bears, wolves, and as we will hear about today, lynx. I've got a particular fondness for lynx because they share many of the characteristics with cheetah, with massive home ranges and low density for a cat of their size. And their recovery gives a message of hope, I think. Although, as we will hear today, it's not without its challenges, it shows what can be done with sufficient public and government support, and it also raises the important question as to whether the UK can also play a role in lynx recovery. We've got a fantastic lineup of 3 speakers this evening. Unfortunately, Dr. Christine Breitenmoser is unable to be here, so we have slightly longer talks from our other 3 speakers, and Dr. Urs Breitenmoser will cover the topic of genetic considerations for lynx reintroduction. The format of the evening is going to start with presentations from our speakers, and then this will be followed with a question and answer panel discussion, which will provide lots of opportunities for you to put your questions to the speakers. As a reminder, we're filming tonight's event, so the recording can be published on our YouTube channel and so that we can reach our online audiences. So if you ask a question during the question and answer, please be aware that your voice will be included in this recording. Okay, so the first of our speakers is Dr. David Hetherington. David lives in the Cairngorms National Park, where he works on strategic habitat restoration. He also sits on the project management group of the Saving Wildcats project, which will see the first releases of the captive bred wildcats in the Cairngorms actually today, I think. In his spare time, he sits on the board of the rewilding charity Trees for Life. In 2005, he completed his PhD at the University of Aberdeen on the feasibility of reintroducing the Eurasian lynx to Scotland. And in 2018, which you might have seen some copies outside, you might purchase a copy, he published a book, The Lynx and Us, with Swiss-based photographer Lauren Geslin, which explores the implications for UK for lynx reintroduction. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to be at the ZSL this evening to talk to you about the lynx and us. I have to say it took a long time for me to get here yesterday from my home in the Cairngorms National Park, which is a timely reminder, if any were needed, of just how remote and isolated the south of England is. So I'm going to talk to you, it's really going to be a bit of a canter through an introduction to the Eurasian lynx and its relationship with humans across Europe and what the implications are for us here in the UK. I've called it The Lynx and Us. That's the same title as a book that I co-produced with a very talented photographer, Laurent Gélin, and we will see quite a few of his photographs in the next few slides. when I say lynx, we're talking about the Eurasian lynx. It's one of 4 species of lynx found throughout the world. We also have the bobcat, the Canada lynx, and the Iberian lynx, and they all have the same basic body plan of a lynx, which is long-legged, tufted ears, short-tailed, and the ruffed face. But that's kind of where the similarities end between the Eurasian lynx and the other 3. The other 3 species tend to focus more on things like rabbits, hares, and rodents. The Eurasian lynx, on the other hand, is a big game hunter. So, and right across the very broad geographical range, the number 1 prey tends to be the roe deer. The roe deer is the ideal size. It's about the similar sort of size to the lynx itself, about 20 to 25 kilos. So there's enough food there to last several days, but it's not so big that it can't be easily overpowered. That said, Eurasian lynx can kill larger ungulates, hoofed animals. In parts of Europe, they'll take chamois. In the Nordic countries, they'll take semi-domestic reindeer. And in parts of Eastern Europe, they will take red deer, albeit they don't take the stags, which are too big and too powerful. It's important for us, I think, to understand how Eurasian lynx hunt, because so often I hear people make assumptions about how Eurasian lynx hunt, and what they're inadvertently doing is describing the hunting behavior of wolves. So the key thing to understand about Eurasian lynx is it's an ambush hunter. It needs to get close enough to launch a surprise attack, and it all needs to be over in a matter of meters and a matter of seconds. So consequently, woodland is really key habitat for Eurasian lynx in Europe. An ideal mixture of cover in there, standing timber, fallen timber, understory, and of course, typically, things like roe deer are often found in and around woodland. The other thing that we really need to get our heads around, particularly in this country where we're used to dealing with smaller predators, is just how much space a Eurasian lynx, and indeed a Eurasian lynx population, needs. As Sarah suggested, they're a very low density animal. They're highly territorial, so they have home ranges. So a male won't tolerate another male in his home range. A female won't tolerate another female in her home range, but a male home range may encompass several female home ranges. So the size of the home range is determined partly by gender, but also by the availability of prey. So if we go far north into Europe, where there's less solar energy, less vegetative growth, fewer deer, then lynx home ranges have to be much larger. And actually, we're talking several thousand square kilometers in some instances. So huge areas required for 1 or 2 lynx to patrol. If you come further south, for example, into Switzerland, where there's more solar energy and more deer, then home ranges might only be 100 square kilometers for a female, perhaps something like 200 square kilometers for a male. So much smaller, but nevertheless, those areas are still huge compared to the predators that we're used to living with in Britain today, like foxes, badgers, pine martens, etc. Males and females are only together for a couple of days in the late winter breeding season. Eurasian lynx are fundamentally solitary animals. The mating takes place over a couple of days, and then there's a gestation period for a couple of months, and the female will give birth to typically between 2 and 4 kittens in a secure den site in the late spring. And those kittens will stay with her for 10 months. They will eventually they will follow her around the home range and learn how to hunt prey by watching her. But after 10 months, she comes back into season and she pushes them out. And they then have to go and find their own way in the world. And at this point, they're only really half size. And so they have to negotiate, aggressive territorial adult lynx that are twice their size. They have to be able to take down roe deer that are twice their size. And they have to very often complete a dispersal journey of several tens of kilometers across sometimes quite hostile territory, roads and railway lines and towns and cities and different forms of land use in the landscape. So it's a challenging time, and we do see high mortality amongst juvenile and subadult lynx. So that's Eurasian lynx ecology in a nutshell. What about the story about Eurasian lynx in Britain? Were they even here? Can we even talk about reintroducing them? Well, yes, we know they were here because their bones have been found the length and breadth of the island of Britain, from the south coast of England right up to the north coast of Scotland, typically in limestone caves. And this skull here was found in the bone caves of northwest Sutherland in the Scottish Highlands. So we know that they were here. The cultural evidence suggests that they lived for quite a bit after the most recent carbon date. So the most recent carbon date is from the early medieval period, and that comes from North Yorkshire. But we have some cultural evidence suggesting that they lived for many centuries beyond that. So the 15th century Welsh poet, Dafydd Nant Mor, talks about the animals of North Wales in one of his poems. He talks about how the roe deer is moving up into the hills to take advantage of the fresh growth in the summer. And the roe deer are being followed by an animal that he refers to as the llawbrich, which literally means the speckled lion. So here's an animal, a speckled lion. What else could that be? It must be a Eurasian lynx following its favoured prey in the hills of North Wales in the 15th century. And if they're in the hills of North Wales in the 15th century, there's every likelihood they're in the Scottish Highlands at the same time, and possibly for a little bit longer, given that the Highlands has acted as a last British stronghold for a variety of predators, from wildcats and pine martens and eagles to wolves. So it may well be that we had this species as recently as something like the 16th century. Why did they disappear? Well, this is an animal that needs big wooded landscapes with healthy populations of deer in them, and the British Isles deforested quite severely and much earlier than other parts of Europe. And that is almost certainly going to have an impact on a species that needs large wooded landscapes. Our deer populations would have been affected. Roe deer were wiped out from most of the island of Britain. The last few clung on in parts of the Highlands, and a similar picture for red deer. And of course, humans were also hunting them directly for fun, for fur, or indeed to persecute a competitor for their livestock, or indeed the deer that they also wanted to hunt. So they did live here for until much more recently than we used to think, but it's still, compared to comparable areas in Europe, it was a little bit earlier, that extinction, so it would seem. If that's still the situation today, if we still have a deforested landscape with no deer in it, then clearly we can't really talk about reintroduction. That would be unethical. But do we have enough well-connected habitat and sufficient prey to support a reintroduced population? This photograph was taken in the Cairngorms National Park, and it gives some hint that some parts of Britain, particularly in Scotland, have reforested to a large extent. They're still a long way short of the amount of woodland cover they had historically, but over the course of the last century or so, we've seen a quadrupling of woodland cover in Scotland. Much of that has been achieved through non-native conifer plantations, but of course, lynx don't care what nationality the trees are. If the trees are North American, it couldn't care less. It's ambush cover. We've also, of course, regained many of our deer populations. Roe deer and red deer are now really quite abundant in Scotland, and we're seeing those species and indeed introduced species becoming more and more common, not just in Scotland, but elsewhere on the island of Britain. I've been hearing some fantastic stories about huge densities of muntjac living in parts of England. But in Scotland, we've also gained the fallow deer and the sika deer. And again, the lynx doesn't care if the deer are Japanese and he's having to ambush it from an American tree. It doesn't care. It's protein and it's cover. So we do have a lot more deer. Harkening back to my PhD research at the University of Aberdeen about 20 years ago, I examined, using radio collaring data from lynx that had been reintroduced to Switzerland. We're moving across quite a fragmented landscape. I applied that habitat use data to Scotland and identified that there were two potential lynx habitat networks. A relatively small one, or comparative to further north, in the south of Scotland, which actually straddles the border into Kielder. And then they're separated from, in this area here, through the central belt, where most of the population of Scotland lives, and where it's got a really dense road and rail network. But there's a much larger potential habitat network north of the central belt that goes from Argyll to Aberdeenshire to Sutherland. And the deer densities tend to be higher in this landscape. So at that time, I concluded that the southern population could probably support about 50 lynx, and the larger one about 400 lynx. And long-term viability suggested that this one was more viable, and that this one perhaps would be not quite so viable unless, of course, you were going to get more involved and intervene by adding lynx periodically. And there would be a fair bit of difficulty for lynx to move across this rather dense transport line across the centre of Scotland there. But we do have enough habitat and prey in at least this part of the UK to support a reintroduced lynx population. So in terms of the continent of Europe then, we see a similar situation, albeit maybe a little bit later. We know that people were hunting lynx. This is a 14th century French illustration. We know that the continent of Europe as a whole deforested to a large extent, and that deer populations declined and went extinct in several landscapes. So similar sorts of processes happening across the continent. And so we see a pattern of decline. So the three shades of green together show probably the native distribution of the Eurasian lynx. They would have occurred from the north of Iberia and the British Isles all the way east into Russia to the Pacific coast. But by the time we get to 1800, they've gone from the light green areas. They've been squeezed out by humans and human activity. So in Western and Central Europe, they're only found in the thinly populated mountainous parts, such as the Pyrenees and the Massif Central and the Alps. And of course, there's still a big population in the north and east. But the persecution in particular continues, the habitat loss continues. So by the time we get to 1950, they're just found in the dark green areas. So pockets of the Scandinavian peninsula, the big forest complexes of Russia and some of the adjoining areas, and indeed the mountainous areas such as the Carpathians and the Balkan Mountains in the east. So they've completely been wiped out from Western and Central Europe by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century. So it's been a tough history for the Eurasian lynx living alongside humans in the continent of Europe. But again, things have changed. Over the course of the 20th century, Europe began to reforest. Deer populations started to recover, helped by reintroductions. Societal attitudes changed. People began to understand the discipline of ecology and realize that species are interconnected, and perhaps removing predators from landscape isn't the right thing to do, and that has implications. So people firstly legally protected the remnant populations, which allowed recolonization in some areas, particularly in Scandinavia. And even in some landscapes in Central and Western Europe, people were actively taking lynx from further east and releasing them back into landscapes that only a matter of decades beforehand, they were paying people to kill the last one. So a dramatic change. And so the map of Europe looks quite different now. We see big recolonization in the north, in the Scandinavian peninsula in particular, and then these red areas in the central and western parts of Europe are where there have been several reintroductions, including in Switzerland, and we're going to hear more about that, and elsewhere on the continent from Urs in a second. But of course, these are not wildernesses that lynx have been reintroduced to in many instances. They're pretty busy human-modified landscapes where there's farming and forestry and outdoor recreation and hunting. And Laurent's photograph here was taken in the Swiss Jura Mountains. The human population density in the Swiss Jura Mountains is above 100 per square kilometre. If you compare that with my local authority area, Highland, which is bigger than Wales, it has a human population density of 9 people per square kilometre. So yes, there are some parts of Britain that are really busy, and there are some parts that really aren't, that are much less densely populated. So I'm not going to pretend that living cheek by jowl with lynx and humans is easy and straightforward. There are conflicts, there are problems. We see illegal killing of lynx right across Europe. It doesn't matter whether it's a rich country, a poor country, or a country where there's a closed season or where there's full legal strict protection. We do see illegal persecution happening. This lynx here has been killed illegally, unfortunately. And the number one conflict across Europe between humans and lynx isn't, as we might expect perhaps in Britain, to be livestock. It's actually about deer. Lynx are year-round predators of deer. They're very good at killing deer, and hunting tends to be pretty populist across the continent of Europe. The next biggest, the secondary conflict, is around sheep in particular. But that is not this sort of pan-European conflict that hunting is. It's a very much more nuanced thing. It varies in space and time. There are landscapes where lynx share with sheep, and that is not an issue. So the Carpathian Mountains, for example, of Slovakia and Romania, where they've always had their large carnivores, lynx, wolves, bears, and they've always maintained traditional shepherding, 24/7 shepherding, corralling at night time, the use of livestock guarding dogs. The shepherds there don't view lynx as a problem. They're possibly still a bit worried about wolves and bears, but they're not worried about lynx. If you go further west into Western Europe, where large carnivores were removed, traditional shepherding was discontinued, and where large carnivores are coming back, then you see a very different pattern. The vast majority of sheep are grazed in flocks in open pasture, and that is not the type of landscape that lynx typically want to be hunting in. I mean, a flock is an anti-predator behavior. There are many hundreds of ears, eyes, and noses on the lookout for predators here, and a lynx doesn't want to be rampaging around an open field chasing a flock of sheep. That's just not what they do. Which isn't to say that predation by lynx doesn't happen. It does, but it's small scale, it's localized, and it's quite controllable. The third scenario, which is very different and very unique, it's worth saying that, and by far and away the worst case scenario is a situation that you encounter in Norway. Norway is very special in this regard. They're paying out something like 3 million euros worth of compensation to sheep farmers every year for losses to lynx. So, but you need to understand the animal husbandry. In Norway, they're grazing 2.5 million sheep in woodland, which is very unusual. That, of course, is the lynx-infested ambush cover, where deer densities are actually pretty low. Now, Norwegian scientists have shown that even if you have a lot of sheep in the woods with the lynx, if you've got a density of 4 or more roe deer per square kilometre, then you stop losing sheep. Now, they regard 4 as being quite a high density. That's actually not a high density by most European countries, and certainly not by UK standards. But interestingly, if you compare it to Sweden, Sweden has a very long border with Norway, as I'm sure you know. They're not paying out 3 million euros. They're not paying out 300,000 euros. They're paying out 37,000 euros per annum for sheep lost to lynx, and that's despite there being 4 times as many lynx in Sweden as there is in Norway. And it shows you that's entirely down to a difference in animal husbandry. The sheep are being grazed in open pastures in Sweden, and indeed they have quite a rigorous compensation scheme. In Norway, in 97% of cases where money was paid out, there was no form of verification. Nobody's checking really what has actually killed those sheep, or indeed, if the sheep have been killed by anything. They might still be alive, who knows? It's a system that's open to misinterpretation or even willful abuse. It's a remarkably cavalier approach, it has to be said. But nevertheless, Norwegians are losing sheep to lynx because of the way they husband their sheep. And of course, even well-meaning human beings can be inadvertently deadly. In this really busy continent of ours, there's 750 million people trying to get from A to B as quickly as possible. We can be killing them with our cars and with our trains. The roads and railway lines can act as physical and psychological barriers which might prevent dispersal, and that might end up with genetic problems. So something to think about. But it's not all bad news. It's not all problems. There are opportunities as well. This is a year-round predator of deer. We know that if you have lots of deer, you can have ecological and indeed economic problems. And so they are very effective at hunting deer, but even at low densities, they're very good at finding them, perhaps even better than human hunters. And of course, what they don't eat is left on the forest floor, either to decompose back into the soil or to feed a wide variety of scavengers, from beetles to eagles to bears. And of course, right across Europe, perhaps the #1 vertebrate scavenger of lynx-killed carcasses is the red fox. We see this in studies time and time again. Red foxes are often scavenging lynx-killed carcasses. But they have to be very careful. They've got a cost-benefit analysis to do. They could sit and wait until the lynx is completely finished with that carcass after 4 or 5 days, in which case there's very little left. Or they can sneak in between feeding bouts when the lynx is sleeping nearby, but then they run the risk of being detected and indeed killed. And lynx routinely kill foxes, not just at carcass sites, but as they find them in the wider landscape. And we know from studies in Sweden and Finland that as the lynx recolonized lost areas in Sweden and Finland, the wildlife data showed that populations of capercaillie, black grouse and mountain hare actually increased. And the scientists concluded that was because the lynx were helping to suppress fox populations, which are significant predators of the smaller game. This study from a number of years ago in Switzerland is quite a good one. 29 different lynx were radio tracked and snow tracked over a 10-year time period, and 617 prey animals were collected by the team of researchers. I've arranged them in a league table, and as you might expect, 90% of what they were killing was roe deer and chamois. Right at the bottom of the league table, however, 1 wildcat and 1 capercaillie. Those are 2 species that we're very concerned about in Scotland, and they're frequently mentioned in the context of lynx reintroduction as being problems, risks. But actually 1 of each in 10 years is very low levels of predation. What's interesting, of course, is what comes third in the table, 37 foxes. Now, foxes, unlike lynx, will be competing with wildcats for the same food, rodents, rabbits, that sort of thing. We know that foxes can be significant nest predators of capercaillie, so there's perhaps an issue there. So maybe, we need to think about intra-guild predation. That's big carnivores killing small carnivores, and perhaps there are opportunities there. Lynx watching tourism is often mentioned is going to be the new boon for the rural economy. And I think we have to be quite clear about the ability to see lynx in the landscape is actually very limited. You can go to Finland and sit in a baited hide and see bears and see wolverines, and it's a fantastic experience. I've done that. You can go to northwestern Spain and see wolves moving through a semi-open environment and watch them with telescopes. Brilliant. You can't do either of those things with lynx. They're so shy and so cryptic, you can't guarantee a sighting. but you can use them as a branding icon, as happens in several places, such as this German national park. People want to be in landscapes where there are beautiful, shy, wild creatures such as lynx, and that definitely is working as a sort of destination management tool. So in terms of Scotland in particular, and Britain as a whole, where do I see the potential conflicts arising? Well, of course, it's quite hard to predict because conflicts are not always built around reality. They can be built around perceptions, around politics and human psychology. But in theory, we shouldn't have a massive conflict between lynx and people around deer. We have an awful lot of deer. We typically don't have very many people shooting them. Per head of population, you're 60 times more likely to be a hunter of deer in Norway than you are here in the UK. And we've got burgeoning populations of deer. We're not shooting enough. And of course, in Scotland, the most culturally and economically significant deer are the red deer stags living in an open environment. And lynx are not interested in chasing herds of red deer stags around an open hill. That's not what they do. Of course, we do have the biggest sheep population in Europe by quite some distance. So there's definitely scope for a conflict here. But of course, the vast majority of our sheep are grazed in open pasture, unlike in Norway, and the vast majority of our woodlands contain no sheep. So I think there could well be some losses to lynx if we were to reintroduce lynx, but I think it would be small scale, it would be localized, it wouldn't be the picture that we see in Norway. I'm just going to leave it there. If anybody wants to sort of keep tabs on what I'm saying about lynx and indeed wildcat reintroductions and translocations in the Cairn Gorms and indeed habitat restoration more widely, by all means connect with me on LinkedIn. If you are wanting to ask a specific question about lynx reintroduction, or if you're interested in getting a signed copy of the book, by all means send me an email, dave.hetherington@talk21. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Right. So we'll get one question.
Yeah, one question. Yeah. Sorry, let me just come up to the speaker. We have time for one question, one or two questions, if anyone has any questions.
You talked about predation of sheep by lynx. How does that compare to predation of sheep by domestic dogs?
Yeah, I mean, we do definitely lose sheep in this country to dogs. I know in the last few weeks in Scotland alone, there have been quite a few incidences of dogs killing lambs in particular. I don't think the data collection on that is terribly good. I'm not sure we've got a very good picture on exactly how many are getting killed every year and whether that data is collected across the UK. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if dogs are a far bigger risk to sheep than lynx, given how many dogs there are in the countryside.
I did see on the internet the losses in a year are £1.8 billion. So that's the comparison.
Right, yeah, interesting.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, that should go to the microphone. There'll be more opportunities to ask questions in the panel discussion later on. Okay. Another round of applause for our speaker. Thank you. So our second speaker is Dr. Urs Breitenmoser. Urs is a carnivore ecologist. He's formerly senior scientist at the University of Bern and the director of Foundation KORA, Carnivore Ecology and Wildlife Management. Urs has been involved in research projects on carnivore ecology for 40 years and has supervised master and doctoral theses in the frame of the Swiss carnivore projects. Urs's main field of interest is the reintroduction of Eurasian lynx and the reintegration of large carnivores into human-dominated landscapes, and he has co-chaired the IUCN SSC Cat Specialist Group since 2001. Urs has since been involved in many cat research and conservation projects all around the world. Thank you, Urs. Welcome.
So, my wife should be here too, but she couldn't make it, so I'm giving our presentation together. That means I will talk with a few slides about genetics, what I don't know what it really is, but we have a lot of specialists here, and I'd hope that I don't make too much of a fool out of myself. We have been working on lynx together for a long time, first in Switzerland when we studied the ecology of the reintroduced population. Also, we were not involved in the reintroduction for the simple reasons that the reintroductions in Switzerland started more than 50 years ago. And even so, I have gray hair now and I'm retired. I was a little bit too young, actually, when the first lynx were released to be already involved in that. But the lynx distribution today, and David has already actually mentioned this, mainly shows a large population in Scandinavia, but at a very low density. And we have then on continental Europe, we have a lot of populations, small populations, which live at a bit higher density, but are actually limited in space. Lynx is a complicated species, and I want to show you 2 points about this. So first, we have this autochthonous population that are the original population which have all recovered. Because in the 19th century, they were all down to almost being extinct, and a lot of them actually went extinct, especially those in Central and West Europe. They are now reintroduced, but the reintroduced populations are still small. But lynx is also a complicated species because it actually splits, and that's the consequence of the glaciation period, the Pleistocene, where habitat has disappeared and has reconnected and has disappeared again. It's split into several subspecies. So on the one hand, we have two boreal subspecies, lynx and Wrangeli, which covered the huge boreal forest belt from Scandinavia, the Atlantic, all the way to Sakhalin to the Pacific Ocean. This is a more or less continuously occupied area with a huge lynx population, but also living at relatively low density. But then we also have 4 subspecies, I call them the 4 southern subspecies, which are quite different morphologically, ecologically, and are living in much smaller areas. Especially in Europe, the situation is also complicated, and even if we look here, actually, we have 3 subspecies only in Europe, and because these are considered to be evolutionarily significant units, we also want to conserve these subspecies as such. So not every lynx is just a lynx. By the way, we then also have another lynx species down here in Iberia, the Iberian lynx, which we, however, consider not only a different subspecies, but a different species. So we have to deal with this situation, and I will concentrate in my talk mainly on this area here, on what I call continental Europe, which is complicated in itself. On the one hand, we have these 3 different subspecies, and we have 11 reintroduced populations. All these populations are still small, isolated, and need somehow to be managed and conserved. But let's first have a very quick look at the history of lynx. Of course, lynx was persecuted as all large carnivores because we simply wanted to get rid of them. And at that time, wildlife management was successful. They aimed to eradicate them, and they did it. But it was not only by direct persecution. That's important to understand when we are looking now to the recovery of lynx population. So one very important reason is that we also eradicated most of the prey of the lynx. Deer populations across Europe were extremely low at one point, not at every point at the same time, but a lot of these deer populations were close to extinction. The second point was that livestock increasingly replaced wildlife, increased the conflict, eased persecution, but also had its impact on the habitat. What you see here is a goat herd in the Swiss Alps in the late 19th century. Switzerland was known to be a goat country, and goats and forests don't go together. You have even goats or you have forests. So that has actually contributed to the deforestation as much as has an overexploitation, especially in the second half of the 19th century, when fossil fuels were not yet really important, but the energy consumption and the wood consumption was tremendous. This is a picture from the late 19th century. Wood actually drifted out of the Alps. The alpine forests were untouched for a very long time because of logistics reasons. It was very difficult to get the wood out. At that time, this wood was actually sold to cities like Marseille, Rotterdam, probably also London actually. They were the only logs left over in continental Europe that you could use to build a ship, big masts and so on. And suddenly this wood became so economically important that they also got them from the remote areas. Fortunately, this situation has changed again. But it came too late for the lynx. And here is a picture from the Bavarian Alps, a very macabre picture actually, that proudly announces that the last lynx, and these are the last lynx heads here actually, pinned up on a wall, were killed between 1836 and 38. Most of the lynx populations in Central and Western Europe went extinct in the course of the 19th century. Since then, our landscape have changed. In the course of the industrialization, we have seen a huge rural exodus. People have given up villages. This is a picture from the Swiss Alps where forest has overgrown a lot of villages, especially in the south. Roe deer have made a comeback, and I believe that roe deer are today probably more numerous in Europe than ever before. But on the other hand, we have seen a tremendous development of traffic lines, of agglomerations, and so on. So what we have at the moment actually is a landscape that on the one hand has nice forests, and the forest cover in continental Europe here, in this part actually has never been as good as it is today since the medieval ages. And on the other hand, we have a huge fragmentation of the landscape. And that's the challenge, not only to conserve lynx, but actually that's the challenge to conserve large wildlife species in continental Europe, and the same is probably for the British Islands. How can we conserve wildlife species that need huge spaces to have viable populations that need to be able to move around in such a situation where we have on the one hand very good habitat patches, and on the other hand barriers in between that are almost impermeable if you cannot fly. In this situation, more than 50 years ago, the first lynx were released, first in the Swiss Alps, then in Slovenia, that was then still northern Yugoslavia, then in the Jura Mountains and in other situations. But the early reintroductions were done very naive. There was actually a decision of the Swiss government that says that the forest management unit of the Confederation, considering that the canton agrees, in Switzerland always the cantons have to agree to whatever actually the federation wants to do. If the cantons agree that they have the permit to release 1 to 2 pairs of young, healthy lynx to reintroduce the population. It is, as we have been discussing about the genetics, about the viability and so on, it is almost a funny naivety actually to believe that with 1 to 2 pairs of lynx released, you can actually recover a population. But that's the situation that we have today, and I will show you more about this. We have now these small and isolated populations. We have an autochthonous population of Carpathian lynx, and in the early reintroductions, everybody has used wild, translocated lynx from the Carpathians, especially from Slovakia, to restart populations. At that time, people believed that only wild lynx will be able to survive when translocated to form a reintroduction, and therefore very few lynx have been actually released in these different sites. Very few means in average 6 to 8, and in few cases up to 20. I will actually come back to this. But the starting point of most of the populations were always very few individuals, and we will come back to this immediately. The situation today is that we have 3 autochthonous populations here in the Balticum. This is a population of somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 individuals. The Carpathian population here is probably in the range of a bit more than 2,000 individuals. I think these numbers are a bit an overestimation. And we have the problem that the Carpathians today are heavily fragmented, because in the Ukrainian part of the Carpathians, the population seems to be interrupted at the moment. And then we have the reintroduced populations. Here, the Alps, the Jura Mountains, northeastern Switzerland, the Walsh Mountains, and so on and so on. And as you can see, the numbers of these populations are still all very small. So these populations are by no means viable in the long term and need to be managed to be able to conserve. The other thing is, however, the phylogenetics and the genetics. As we have said, we have 3 different subspecies. And in a meeting already in 2010 and again in 2017, we have brought together geneticists and population biologists and so on. I have asked them the question, what is the best to do here? The lynx that were originally living in the Alps and so, they are gone forever. 50 years ago, the people who have started the reintroduction projects have decided to take lynx from the Carpathians, simply because these were the closest lynx and they were similar in the ecology. The Alps or the Jura Mountains are a bit like the Carpathians, so that was the easiest thing to do. And we have then decided in this expert meeting that in this area we should continue to use Carpathian lynx because of genetics, because of the consistency between the populations and so on. And therefore we have sort of a bit artificially, but still, divided continental Europe in 3 areas. The northern lowlands, we think actually should be the expansion of the northern lynx, the Baltic lowland lynx, which have the similar habitats and the similar landscape as we have here in the Balticum. The southernmost Balkan lynx, a critically endangered subspecies, should be maintained as it is, if ever possible, because this is an evolutionarily significant unit and we want to maintain it as it is. And in between here, we consider this as to be the conservation area for the Carpathian lynx. So we have the source population in the Carpathians. We have the translocated lynx that used wild-born Carpathian lynx. And we have one population here, the Harz Mountain, which has tried to use zoo-born lynx, which works pretty well if you do it the right way. But the problem here is that the zoo-born population is an admixed population. We call this generic lynx, and it's actually a mixture between Carpathicus, northern lynx, mainly from Scandinavia, but also Wrangeli, that's the East Siberian lynx, and that's of course something that we don't like too much, this mixed population. But there is a flip side of the coin with regard to the genetics, and let's talk about genetics now. So this here is a graphic that shows you the a measurement for inbreeding, the amount of inbreeding. The higher the column, the stronger the inbreeding of a population is. So you have here the Carpathian source population, which is astonishing actually somewhere in the middle. That's because of the historic bottleneck the Carpathian population went through itself. But then we have the reintroduced populations, which all came from the Carpathian source population, and they are all much smaller and much more inbred. And not surprisingly, the oldest one, which are the Alps, and the Dinaric population, which are now about 50 years old, are considerably higher, have a considerably higher inbreeding coefficient than the other ones. And then we have the Harz population here, which is an admixed population from several subspecies, which is less inbred, even less inbred than the Carpathian source population. Now, how comes? 3 factors. First, this was the latest reintroduced population, only 20 years since. Second, more animals have been released, more than 20. And third, it had a very broad genetic basis, but unfortunately not a wanted broad genetic basis because it was an admixture of several subspecies. So what to do in this situation? We have the most urgent problem to deal with the small populations that have been reintroduced. The reintroduction has started, was done, was considered to be a success because the lynx have established, but it's not, the job is not done yet. Another problem in genetics is actually the genetic drift. If you translocate a few animals, you randomly take part of the gene pool out, you translocate it, and then these animals start to reproduce together, and they will sort of shift away from the source population if they are isolated, as long as they are isolated, and we call this the genetic drift. Now what you see here is the source population and the genetic diversity of the source population, and then you see the Dinaric population here, which has drifted away from it, but interesting enough, not too far. But we have, for instance, the 2 Swiss populations, the Jura mountain population and the Alps, which have drifted quite far away. And that's, of course, also connected to a loss of genetic information. So both inbreeding and genetic drift actually diminish the genetic variability and therefore the potential response to environmental changes. What we also see here, a population in between. The northeastern Swiss population was founded by translocating lynx and Jura animals to northeastern Switzerland to found a new population to try to admix it. And actually it works, as you can see, but of course we can only mix what we have, and we don't get closer to the original population. We can just actually sort of do something about the genetic variability in Switzerland itself. So, again, the genetic drift is strong in the oldest population, and it is a measurement also for the isolation and for the total population size. And if we look at the development of the heterozygosity in the Swiss populations, we have collected samples since 1993. Unfortunately, we don't know what was further since the early 70s, simply because we don't have the samples. But you see that the populations here have developed in a different way. The Jura Mountains and the Northwestern Alps, first they have sort of been on a certain level, then they have started to decrease, and then something interesting happened. And this shows us about the management and about what we could do. So the Northwestern Alp population here was further decreasing because of management interventions. In this moment here, we had a high incidence of lynx killing sheep, and there was a need to do something. On the one hand, we suddenly had a high amount of poaching. People killed lynx, they had enough, now we want to get rid of these animals. There was nothing that we could do about it. On the other hand, we have started to kill lynx, to remove lynx, lethally removal of lynx that were specializing on sheep, because we didn't want to have this in the population. And the third measure was that we have started to take some lynx out and translocate them to eastern Switzerland to found this new population. So a strong management intervention, wanted and unwanted actually, has decreased the population size, and along with it actually the heterozygosity actually decreased again. In the Jura Mountains, something else happened. As far as we know, only 2 individuals, they were genetically identified, only 2 individuals from the Alps made it across the Swiss plateau, which we consider that as a barrier actually. and joined the population. Luckily, both of them reproduced. One was a male and one was a female. And you can see the effect of only 2 animals actually coming in, which has immediately changed the situation with regard to the genetic setup. Okay. What are we going to do now? We have had several meetings among experts at the moment, actually, to sort of try to develop a strategy. And it is relatively clear, first, we need to secure the survival of the Carpathian source population, and then we need genetic remedy and more stepping stone reintroductions. A few are planned here in Germany, in the western part of the realm of the Carpathian lynx. And in the long run, we want to conserve this population here as the Carpathian lynx meta-population in West and Central Europe. That means we need to increase the connectivity, corridors, and so on. And on the other hand, we need to translocate animals if needed. Animals can make it, for instance, across the river of Rhine and so on, but it's always the males that actually do this. And the females don't actually colonize because they are very philopatric. And that's the problem. But we need to do more dispersal, assisted in the beginning, and then later on it will work. So what we are now going to do, first, we have proposed to the countries to develop a conservation strategy for the Carpathian population. And the second thing is that we want to set up a few rules and then submit them to the countries, actually, how to deal with the Carpathian population here in the reintroduced area. And that's the last slide. So we have now this Carpathian lynx working group. That's about 50 experts from the whole continental Europe. We developed strategies and hands-on protocols. Then we are working with the range countries through all international treaties that are available. The Berne Convention, the Convention on Migratory Species, Carpathian Convention, Alpine Convention, and so on. We then submit these strategies and protocols to be adopted by the conventions and by the range countries as a common understanding and agreed protocol. We need to work together, and we need to have the support by the countries and by the state institutions to actually achieve this large plan. And finally, we want to convince all governments and all organizations involved that funding to projects should only be given if they would follow this common strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Urs. We have time for just 1 or 2 questions, if there's any. Yes, Ray.
If I'm not moving too far ahead, I mean with the meeting, not with the idea, sorry. What subspecies would you suggest came to England, to Europe, to Britain, to Scotland as well, of course?
Yeah, as I said, for the western part of continental Europe, the original lynx are gone forever. We can do whatever we want. We don't know exactly, actually. We have discussed this afternoon whether it would be possible to do some ancient DNA analysis, but it was certainly not Carpathian lynx. It may possibly have been something else from northern lynx. So I think it needs then to be a decision, and what and that's now IUCN actually recommendation is, if you cannot use the original species for reintroduced, then you should probably rather look at the most convenient ecotype. So I would then look actually for the one lynx that fits most to the landscapes, because there's not only one landscape on the UK, and to the climate, to prey availability, and so on. So that will be matter of discussion. I assume it would be, again, Carpathian lynx or northern lynx, and unfortunately the British landscape is somewhere in between the mountainous and the flat area. But personally, I think it's probably not so important either of these 2 subspecies would possibly deal well with your landscapes.
Thank you, Urs. Thanks. Our final speaker is Kat Walsh. Kat is the Senior Environmental Specialist for Terrestrial Mammals at Natural England. She's the Government Advisor for the Natural Environment in England, and she leads on Natural England's mammal conservation agenda. She establishes and commissions nationally strategic research and monitoring programmes for protected mammal species. She provides advice across Natural England's functions internally, externally, to partners, customers and stakeholders on the mammal ecology and the conservation of protected areas, and her 20-plus years of work in the environmental sector has spanned the charity, private and government sector, both nationally and internationally. Kat undertook a Churchill Fellowship in 2019 to 2020, which looked at assessing the suitability of lynx and wildcat reintroduction in the UK. Thank you. Welcome.
So, hi everybody. After those two fantastic talks, the talk you've all been waiting for, the legal talk. How exciting. Right, so lynx, currently not a protected species in Great Britain. What I should have started by saying is, although my talk is about Britain, a lot of it's England focused because I work for Natural England, but it will cover England, Wales and Scotland where it can. So currently not a protected species in Great Britain. Under Section 14 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, it's actually unlawful to release them. And Section 4, Wildlife and Countryside Act just covers England and Wales. It's not applicable in Scotland. If the species were to be reintroduced, though, it would become a protected species after a certain amount of time. And under Article 11.2 of the Berne Convention, which we're a signatory to, we're encouraged to consider the release of species, including lynx, but we're not required to do so. And the reason why it's unlawful, I should have said, for the Wildlife and Countryside Act to release them is because they're not ordinarily resident species. Maybe the most pertinent act, as far as the legislation is concerned, is the Dangerous Wild Animals Act of 1976. Now, this legislation has changed over the years since 76, so it's changed in 2007, 2010 and 2018, and it applies across all three countries, England, Wales and Scotland. The lynx is listed under this Act, and it's designed to regulate the keeping of dangerous wild animals, which this Act considers it is. Protects the public and the welfare of those kept animals, and crucially, the licensing is administered by your relevant local authority to where you would look at housing those animals. It states that the animals have to be held in accommodation at all times. By that, it basically means preventing their escape into the wild. So that doesn't necessarily mean a zoo-type situation. This could just be some fencing, whatever is pertinent to that particular animal under that Act. So there's currently no provision to release animals into the wild under that Act. So here's a picture of a lynx in captivity. This was taken in Germany, I think from one of the same areas of David's talk. So this is in Bad Harzburg in the Harz National Park area, where people can go along and see a few animals that are held in captivity. And they were released, as Urs was saying, back in around 2000. And you can go along and have time talks and listen to the rangers talk about the ecology of the species and those that have been relatively recently been reintroduced into that area. So it's a good family day out and learn more about the species. So here's another shot. Not as exciting as David's photos, I'd say, not as great as those, but so going back to the Great Britain situation, so any proposal to amend these pieces of legislation would require the support of the Secretary of State. You've probably heard the views in the media of the Secretary of State's views at this current time, and she's not in favour of this species being released at present. DEFRA, who have responsibility for amending environmental legislation, have also stated that they have no plans to amend the Dangerous Wild Animals Act currently. So there is some general guidance about species reintroduction. This is talking about all species that can be found on the statutory agency websites. So in relation to England, we have a relatively recently established England Code, which we ask people to follow. And you can also find the associated guidance and application forms on the .gov website, and there's a little picture of the first page of that. Nature Scot also have a very similar document, the Scottish Code for Conservation Translocations, and both of those codes are based on the IUCN guidelines. And Natural Resources Wales have told me relatively recently, in a conversation I had with them the other day, that they're drafting their own guidance, and that will be out in due course. So we also in England have a species reintroduction task force. This has only been going for a few months. It's chaired by Andy Clements, and it's an independent technical advisory group, so bringing together a range of experts and specialists in this particular area to whom we can go for advice. So the idea is they give us guidance on existing reintroductions across a wide range of taxa, but also looking into potential reintroductions in the future. So really useful group to have. You know, maybe if we overcome those barriers, we might see something like this. So this was back in 2019, and this was the 17th animal to be reintroduced here.
Bitte.
It's all very exciting. Lots of photography, camera clicks going on in the background. That's what it's all held up. There he goes. Right, that's it. That's my Chris Whitty moment over. I now know how he felt after all those various next slide please moments. So, as I said, if you can get over all of those hurdles, some of which obviously seem quite difficult at this moment in time, if anybody were to submit an application into one of the statutory agencies, such as Natural England, we expect you to consider these areas, and this comes through the England Code and those other codes that I've talked about, and other headline areas that sit in the IUCN guidelines. So these projects clearly take a substantive amount of planning. The Palatinate Forest reintroduction that I showed there, they first started discussing that in Germany back in 1977. It actually started to happen as a project in 2016. That's the length of time we can be talking about for projects such as this. So they should include development of a clear communication plan, feasibility study, disease risk analysis, compensation package, and exit strategy, and should establish who is responsible for which part of the reintroduction of the project right from the outset. And there needs to be ongoing commitment to a project such as this. Effective liaison and communication with all stakeholders and interested parties over an ongoing period of time. Ongoing monitoring, including health and surveillance plan with a set of long-term goals and a management strategy over that defined time period. So just digging a bit more into the ecological feasibility, what do I mean by that? So as has been discussed, where is your source population coming from, the genetic origin of that? How many animals are you going to reintroduce, and over what length of time? Those sort of questions you should be thinking about. Are they going to be wild caught, captive bred? Is there a mixture of that? And if they're captive bred, these animals may need an element of training. Habitat suitability, clearly you need to assess, as David said in his talk, is there actually enough space to put these animals in the first place? So again, that's another view of where that lynx you saw in the video was reintroduced into. Now, you know, that's amazing habitat, so that's like fantastic. When I took this picture and looked out across this landscape That's all I could see, as far as the eye could see, was just woodland. But this is an amazing case. You know, this is the largest contiguous area of mainly broadleaf mixed woodland in Europe, and this straddles Germany and France. So this is talking, you know, this is taking things to that level. And you've got to, and Germany is a 33% wood. You know, a third of it is woodland, as opposed to England, as has been mentioned, 13% woodland cover, roughly. I mean, these estimates change. The Forestry Commission puts up statistics. So that's what we're dealing with. So monitoring programs, what are you actually going to look at? So that's measuring the track of the species. So, you know, how are they spreading across the landscape? What's happening with the population? You know, is it increasing, remaining stable, decreasing is something to worry about. The changes in prey density would clearly be an important factor to monitor for an animal such as lynx. The health of the species themselves, you know, so you're looking at the long-term persistence. One thing that people are now considering a lot more with reintroduction programs, and should be, is measuring what the situation is now. Because people, you know, put animals in, whatever they may be, in various different taxa, but they haven't properly assessed what's there already. So there's no baseline, effective baseline to go back to say, well, how much have things changed in the landscape since you did that? There's you know, been no history of what's there previously. And monitoring, we all know with IT, it's spectacularly great these days, and things develop all the time. I can't keep up with it. You just can't. But you know, your program should be able to adapt, that you can use these fancy new techniques, remote techniques, and build that into your monitoring program. Clearly, you know, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, you need to think about compensation schemes when you're talking about lynx. You know, I'm not suggesting at all that we'll be in a Norway type situation, but we know that lynx will take and do take sheep of occasion. So that should really be in place. So you need to have that in place. So who's that going to be administered by? And what exactly will it pay for? Will it pay for losses of livestock? So will it pay for losses of sheep? Will it pay for fencing to prevent lynx getting to those animals, as you know, the case of these countries that have been mentioned? And you know, certainly in Switzerland, there's schemes where if there's for want of a better word, a rogue animal, that, you know, after so long there's been taking, you know, a number of sheep in that particular locale, you know, will it be that that animal is removed lethally? You know, those sort of things you need to be considered. For Tony Sainsbury, if he's in the audience, I don't know if he's gone home now, but disease risk analysis is a fundamental part to any reintroduction program. You know, you need to understand what pathogens the founder animals may bring over to a country. Clearly, we wouldn't want to bring over anything that would cause an unacceptable risk to the destination country, in this case, Britain. You also need to understand what parasites are commensal with the animals, you know, what you expect to have that animal to have, which is perfectly fine, perfectly natural, you know, the normal gut bacteria fauna that we all live with now. So it's understanding that. An element of disease risk analysis as well is the whole transport quarantine element. So all of that needs to be understood. Clearly, as part of all of these schemes, I'm suggesting would happen, but you need to outline an exit strategy, and that's both for socio-economic reasons, but also if there's something that went wrong critically with those links, some unforeseen consequence of what you've done, so that programs can be halted at that time. The big take-home message for me when I did the Churchill Fellowship, and something that's coming out a lot and has been said by the previous speakers, is human-wildlife conflict. You know, people understand now the ecology. There's been many reintroduction programs that we know a lot about that side, but it's that engagement with local communities, local landowners, where you may want to be doing that. That takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of talking to people. People are very skilled in that. Although obviously the conservationists and the academics clearly need to be part of it, the local community and heads need to be talking to each other and encouraging groups and educating others, and before it goes ahead, because you don't want to end up in a situation as I've spoken very speedily. I can slow down now. You don't want to be in a situation where you've put all this time and effort in and you get persecution, and people in the local community being very upset. You would hope to try and avoid that. I'm not saying you could completely eliminate it, but you'd hope to try and avoid that as best as you can. And that side of these reintroduction translocation programs can take an awfully long time. And just to end, really, the question that you need to address, certainly when this would come into a statutory agency, is why do you set out clearly why you think this should happen? Why do you want to do it? What benefit is this for the conservation of this species? What benefit can it bring to Britain? And what are the risks of doing so? I think that's it from me. I'll just leave you with that pretty... Oh, no, I was trying to leave you with the pretty picture. But thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Kat. I think if the other speakers could come up and join the panel while you're coming up here, if there's a question for Kat.
To escape.
You mentioned that the Dangerous Wild Animals Act covers the whole of Britain, and the amendment would require the Secretary of State's approval. Is that amendment in England would require the Secretary of State's approval, or amendment by any of the devolved administrations would also require her or his approval?
Don't question me on the devolved administration side of it, because I may get it completely wrong. But certainly, this DEFRA are the organisation that would amend that legislation as regards England and Wales. So England and Wales certainly, and Secretary of State would have to, ultimately would enable that to happen. I'm not exactly sure how it would play out with Scotland and the devolved side of it. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Kat. Would you be able to join the other speakers?
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. Okay, so now we're open our panel discussion, and we're looking for questions across the panel. So.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. Great talks. I really enjoyed it. Question about Scotland. We can accept, the Cairngorms is probably the best place for the reintroduction of the lynx. I'm thinking about England and Wales, thinking about especially England. Where's the wild areas left? I would say the Lake Districts, parts of the Yorkshire Dales, maybe, parts of the remote part of the northeast, Dartmoor. And in Wales, I would say maybe Snowdonia and the Brecon Beacons. Has there any plans made as to where in England and Wales we could see the reintroduction of this amazing species?
Who wants to answer?
Well, I don't know if you remember that slide that I had of the Scottish habitat networks. The southern habitat network did straddle the border with England into Kielder Forest. So you could release lynx in Kielder Forest, and they would pretty quickly scarper over the border into Scotland, and they would be part of a bigger population there. And I should say, when I did my modelling of the Scottish potential, that was 20 years ago. And I think the woodland deer populations of southern Scotland, and it probably Kielder as well, have probably increased quite a bit since then. So the viability of lynx in that landscape may well have improved in the last 20 years. I must admit, I haven't modelled the rest of the UK, so I can't really say, but I have been quite astonished to hear at recent deer management conferences some of the woodland deer densities that are being found in some parts of England today. Somebody mentioned that 200 muntjac per square kilometre now exist in some parts of England, which is quite phenomenal. So with prey densities like that, it might be that you can have lynx living in quite small habitat networks. It's just because the prey densities are so huge, you could have quite high densities of lynx, but I don't know.
Did you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, when I was preparing this talk, I actually had this European map of forests, and there is a bit of forest in the northern part of the island here. But Wales is certainly not among those that are really green. I know there have been quite a few habitat modeling and predictive modeling for Great Britain, but for me the best proxy to predict the presence of lynx is still actually the forest cover. And there is areas in Central Europe where we have deer, also roe deer, actually living outside of the forest, but I wouldn't know any of these areas that are really colonized by lynx, except of a few areas where lynx just go out of the forest to hunt roe deer and can withdraw back to the forest. So if ever you want to start, I would probably start in the best forested areas of the British Islands.
Another question? Yeah, Ray.
Can I shamelessly...
Oh, was there one?
Do you want a microphone? Shall I wait?
Yes, can you wait? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thinking and knowing how conservative government organisations can be, and how many barriers can be put in the way, even some that are not real, but the government officials seem to imagine. I'm not having a go at anybody in the audience because I see it totally positive, but read this book, Derek Gow, Bring Back the Beaver, and the stories in there are phenomenally funny and incredibly tragic about how people try to stop what we know now has happened. Is still under review, and it took Scottish Natural Heritage 18 years to make the first reintroduction of beaver, and then they caught them all up again because there was some issue, which anyway. So is that a question? I don't know. It can take a hell of a long time.
Can I answer that? So again, I'll speak from the Natural England side. We have had a species recovery programme going since 1993. We have actually reintroduced an awful lot of species across the taxa. We spend quite a lot of money doing it. We work very closely with ZSL doing all the disease risk analysis and continued health surveillance. You know, that health surveillance doesn't stop. It goes on for years. It's a lot of money. And again, just to say the social side of these reintroductions is really, really very, very important. You can inadvertently, by letting animals go, which shouldn't be let go, because it's illegal to do so, and by, I don't know, talking down is the wrong word, but that kind of attitude, you know, forcing views onto people can actually really badly affect other projects. You've just got to be very, very careful and, you know, accept that some things can take quite a bit of time. There's a reason why the legislation is there. Yes, it can seem very rigid and a very blunt tool, but it's there for a very good reason. And the government agencies do an awful lot of engagement with various different organisations. We have huge numbers of stakeholders that we talk to, and local communities. And critically, I should say, these days we talk very closely with each other. So Natural Resources Wales, Natural England, Nature Scot, all liaise very closely with each other. And, you know, we take trips abroad to learn more from, you know, the other countries that have done work. You know, we spend that time engaging. So, yeah.
It is almost impossible to actually sort of organize a reintroduction in a way that everybody is happy. But I can guarantee you that there is many, many ways to do it in a way that everybody is unhappy. And the way of how lynx were released and reintroduced to Switzerland 50 years ago is a really good example for how not to do it. It has taken us a long, long time actually to sort of overcome this, and basically it was overcome by experience, getting used to it. Change of generations, not only one generation, really generations of hunters. And the controversy is still not over, actually. It's still a controversial issue. One thing that has completely disappeared is that people believe that lynx is a dangerous species. I remember when I started in the early 1980s, there were really people who pretended in the Alps that they couldn't send their children to school because of lynxes around now and so on. This has completely disappeared. So that is one thing that people have accepted, but there is still the controversy about predating on domestic animals, on sheep mainly, actually has disappeared too, because we have now management tools to handle this, and this is really good. You need to demonstrate to these people that you don't leave them alone if there is a problem, that the problem is going to be solved. What we have not yet overcome is the controversy with hunters, because lynx were reintroduced to Switzerland on the demand of foresters, and before the lynx were released, the foresters have pretended that lynx is going to control the fast-growing deer population. And after the releases, the foresters have actually tried to demonstrate that there is no impact on deer because it was so controversial. But indeed, yes, they are very efficient predators, and there is an impact on the roe deer population mainly. To a certain extent, also on the chamois population, which is not a big deal for you guys, but still. And it is not just about killing animals, it's about the change of behavior, change of distribution, and so on. But that's also wanted. That is one reason why we should have it. If you want to renaturalize England, if you want to recreate natural ecosystems, the animals that actually prey on the herbivores are part of the ecosystem, and otherwise it's incomplete. But it comes with a certain price, and I think whatever you do, you should really try to avoid to drive a wedge between the rural population and the overwhelming, strong urban population. I mean, we're here sitting in center of London, in one of the largest cities of Europe, and I believe that we have probably an audience which is mainly in favor of rewilding and all of this. I'm pretty sure that if we would go somewhere to rural Scotland or rural northern England, this would be in a different way. The reintroduction of large carnivores is probably one of the best ways to actually sort of separate the urban population from the rural population, and you have to be very careful about this, because this can ultimately, it can and will ultimately then be also misused for political arguments. And that's why it is very important that whatever discussion you do it very carefully, you do it inclusively, and you do it you need to try, of course, to do it based on best available knowledge, and still this will not be sufficient actually to sort of have all these social aspects coming up. It's normal. But the way back is always difficult. It is always much better to conserve a species than to reintroduce it, but that is a situation that we should have thought about a couple of 100 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm here. Thanks.
So just building on that then, I'm interested to know, does each member of the panel think we should reintroduce lynx in Scotland, maybe specifically, given on balance? I know it's difficult to say, but on balance, yes or no?
if you ask this question to me, I can just repeat what I've said before. I've learned this afternoon that there are efforts actually to have more nature and more natural habitat, and that seems to go along with the strategy for biodiversity, with climate change, with carbon offset, and all this actually. And just my opinion is that there is no ecosystem that consists only of plants and plant eaters. And if you have fast-growing deer populations, the best way to control those, and the only way to control them in a way that we can maintain what is, for instance, under the conventional biological diversity called to maintain the evolutionary potential, is actually to have those animals there that have co-evolved with these animals, know how to control them, and actually provide a natural selection, what man never can do. Even if you have a good spotting scope and a good rifle, it's just we just cannot simulate these ecological processes that you want to maintain in a complete ecosystem. And I have for a long time I've been contacted about the reintroduction of lynx in Scotland long ago. I think the first attempts were like in the 1980s and so. And I had visited Scotland when I was a student, actually, a young student, and I didn't see any forests there. I've then returned 20 years later back and now in the last time, and it is amazing how this landscape actually has changed. It is really amazing. It goes relatively fast. Even in a man's lifetime, you can actually see these changes, and I think there is a chance to renaturalize the British Islands. Personally, I'm certainly of the opinion that you need to consider the whole of the British complex with regard to this. This is not a project to bring a species like lynx black. Is not a project that you can look at only cairngorms or only whales or only whatever and so on. That's what I tried to bring across with my example of continental Europe. It is a large-scale process, and you can maintain in the modern landscape, human-dominated landscape, with a lot of this matrix with open agricultural areas. I'm convinced that you can maintain such species only in the form of a managed metapopulation. But that's the reality for most parts of our world today, and we have to accept this. And even assisted translocation may be needed for a long time, but we have discussed it this afternoon, not only for the lynx. Many large carnivores, and especially cats, we will in the future only be able to maintain if we actually manage them as metapopulations.
I would just add to that, until fairly recently, say 20 years ago, we believed that lynx died out in the island of Britain because of natural climate change, and therefore the case for reintroduction just isn't there. We now know, thanks to radiocarbon dating and looking at the cultural evidence, that they lived here much more recently. I think we can pretty squarely point the finger of blame at human activity for that. So I think that then creates a strong moral case for bringing lynx back, assuming, of course, that we have the environmental conditions for them. And at least in some parts of the UK, I think we do have enough habitat and indeed enough prey. And in fact, it would seem that the habitat is expanding, and it may well be that the prey populations are expanding as well. And as we try to tackle the twin crises of biodiversity and climate change, and of course one of the things we're doing, certainly in Scotland, we've got some very bold targets for woodland expansion. Woodland is expanding all the time, and of course that's partly being used to address climate change, although there are nuances and complexities there. But we're creating more and more lynx habitat, and we're creating more and more deer habitat. And of course, deer can have an impact on those trees that we're trying to plant, whether we're planting them for carbon or biodiversity or timber. I think deer management is having to become something that we give much more thought to. So I think increasingly, I think there is a place for lynx in Britain, but ultimately, of course, it's a socio-political consideration. And reintroduction in Scotland is going to have to be a choice that the people of Scotland make, and that remains to be seen.
Yeah, so how do I follow on from these guys? Because they've pretty much said everything that I would say. But, you know, echoing that last point, it is a choice and it has to be considered across the 3 countries. You can't, as has been said, just consider it in isolation. It would be, you know, sensibly, that's the way you'd need to look at it. And as I say, you know, people have to be on board with this to make it work, to make it happen, if it was to happen. So.
At the front, yeah.
I was just wondering what factors would require captive breeding of the Eurasian lynx and maybe subspecies. Do you think that is something that will be required? And if so, how successful is it with a species like that?
So we know that lynx born in captivity can relatively easily be rewilded. I'm always amazed actually how well it works. We have several examples of wanted or unwanted lynx that were released to the wild. These are lynx born in a zoo, in an enclosure, never have seen a roe deer. What did they do? They went out and preyed on roe deer. It's amazing. I don't know. It seems to be hardwired. I can't explain it, but it's really amazing. But there is, of course, a few things. Now, we had 4 projects in Europe, 3 of them in Poland because they don't care, that were using zoo-born lynx without the proper investigation into the genetics of these animals. That is IUCN, actually clearly recommends to consider well-justified subspecies which we could consider to be evolutionarily significant units. If there is no need to admix subspecies because they are no longer viable as subspecies, we recommend to not do it. Now, in the case of the lynx, there is a lot of lynx in captivity in Europe, but most of them are generic. And what the EASA, that's the European Association of Zoos and Aquarium, together with, at the moment, the German, but other actually countries are joining in with the wildlife parks which hold lynx, are doing is they are starting separate the 2 subspecies that we have in Europe, the northern lynx and the Carpathian lynx. The Balkan lynx is not in captivity. And to start breeding there as subspecies lines. That takes, first of all, a lot of genetic research to identify them, and then it takes a clever breeding program. And then, with regard to the reintroduction, and we now want to use both wild-born lynx from the source population that are fulfilling the genetic requirements, zoo-born lynx, again from the breeding programs that are fulfilling the genetic requirements, and also orphan lynx, actually, if they actually are still able to be rewilded for doing genetic remedy, reinforcement, but also new reintroductions, stepping stone reintroductions, or all this. And there is now a set of rules that needs to be observed to be able to use a zoo-born lynx. One is, for instance, that at the very beginning, it has to be decided if a litter actually that is born will go to the wild or will stay in captivity. If you want to have lynx staying in captivity, it's good if they are adapted to people. They don't need to be really habituated, but at least they shouldn't be afraid of people and they should be aware of people, and so you need to adapt them to the presence of people at a very early age. If you want to use them for being rewilded, of course, it's exactly the opposite. Then they need to be bred under exclusion of people. Then they need to go to a training enclosure where they at least get full carcass feeding. Feeding with living species is in most countries of Europe illegal, so you can't really train them, but if you actually can use at least road kills of roe deer and so on, that they actually learn what the roe deer is, how to open it and how to feed on it, that should be enough. And then they need to be tested from their, of course, from their physical health, from their genetics is of course, but also from their behavior aspects, actually, whether they would most likely be fit to go into a reintroduction program. But yes, it is possible. We have this afternoon been talking about the lynx in Britain, and to my understanding, it is not known what kind of lynx you have. Most probably generic lynx. So that would have to be separated. Now, that will take a long time to actually build up these breeding programs. And but for continental Europe is now foreseen for the Carpathian lynx to provide more animals. As far as we know, the genetic diversity of the Sioux Carpathian lynx population is already larger than the genetic diversity of, for instance, the Slovakian population. So that's another reason. So we probably have in the Sioux population genes that we don't have any longer in the wild.
Thank you. Are we out of time, Linda? Yeah, okay. So it remains for me to thank all our speakers for their fascinating, thought-provoking presentations, and for all of you for getting involved in the question and answer session and making the journey to join us. So a round of applause. Just to let you know, we're taking a break over the summer while we prepare the next year's programme of science and conservation events. The next one will be held in October. Please keep an eye on the What's On page of our website, of the ZSL website, for further updates. Please also don't forget to keep listening and subscribing to the ZSL Wild Science podcast. Our latest episode is all about the role of zoos and aquaria in helping to bring species back from the brink of extinction. Please also let us know what you thought of tonight's event in our feedback survey, which should be making its way to your email inbox very soon. And thank you again for coming, and good night. Thank you.